Hi everyone. May I have your attention? Welcome back to Ethics at Noon, and today we will have William Gregson's presentation on breaking the invisible chain of slavery, recognition's motivational problem, and Frederick Douglass's abolitionist politics of shame. That's a very long title, but
Received my first note. Thank you. Before I begin, I'll just thank you all for being here, and also mention that I've got a bit of a cold, so I apologize in advance if I have to take a quick, blow my nose or cough break, or not projecting as much maybe. This paper I'm presenting to you today is a chapter draft, as well as I hope a standalone paper. But as the title suggests, it seeks to make an intervention in debates on the politics of recognition through an engagement with Frederick Douglass, the 19th century American abolitionist, orator, suffragist, statesman, autobiographer who escaped from slavery in 1838. It'll be examining what I think is the largely overlooked motivational problem in recognition theory, and how Douglass uniquely understood this problem and sought to navigate it in his political life. And one of the ways he will go about the latter, I argue, will be the abolitionist politics of shame. So first, I'll just quickly situate us and describe what I mean by the politics of recognition. So from land acknowledgements to EDI programs to parliamentary gender quotas to affirmative action measures and debates surrounding representation in media, there is today the widespread intuition that securing affirmative recognition from the members of one's political community is a matter of basic human dignity. Closely associated with identity politics and debates on multiculturalism, the politics of recognition, or the recognition paradigm, gained prominence at the tail end of the 20th century, particularly with the works of Charles Taylor and Axel Honneth, but other names that may come to mind as Pimlico, Patton, and so on. These works emphasized, what unites these works, these diverse works, is it emphasizes the psychological, moral, and political harms of pervasive misrecognition. For example, stereotypes, right? By extension, the normative objective of the politics of recognition is to foster broad social patterns of mutual recognition and respect between individuals and groups, whether that be accomplished through certain rights or endowments, institutional accommodations, or a broad cultural disposition of toleration and respect. And one of the things that was appealing about this way of thinking about politics or political conflict or social justice is that it offered an alternative, or at least a supplement to the dominant kind of distributive conceptions of justice. It captured kinds of social conflict or grievances that are not necessarily captured by distributive conflicts. So today, I think we are arguably witnessing, especially in the United States, but across the globe, an attack or backlash against the politics of recognition as well as its associated policies. But the paradigm has also been criticized in critical theory by progressives and the left as well for a variety of reasons, whether that be concerns over essentialism, taking attention away from redistribution and structural power, a tendency to reproduce colonial relations through a politics of reconciliation, and so on. I included some of the popular examples here. But a concern, critique, or problem that I think has not been explored at length in recognition theory is what I'm calling the motivational problem. Most studies it should be pretty clear, most studies of the political and moral salience of recognition focus exclusively on the misrecognition of the oppressed. It's widely acknowledged that struggles for recognition emerge out of and are in response to asymmetrical social relations. It is marginalized and systematically misrecognized social groups, often but not always minority groups, who generally engage in struggles for recognition, often for the sake of gaining recognition from other frequently hegemonic segments of society. But particularly given this asymmetry, the motivational problem rears its ugly head. The motivational problem arises when there's no clear need or desire on the part of powerful individuals, institutions, or dominant groups to confer affirmative recognition to those struggling for it. In sum, the question that we're asking here is, why would a dominant group already prone to discriminating or withholding recognition change its ways? Aforementioned water. So I think there's some possible answers, and these do exist in the literature, but I'm going to argue that they hold the least amount of weight when the need for recognition is most dire. So the first possible set of answers is what I'm calling self-legitimation, which suggests that recognition is reciprocated or conferred for the sake of the self-legitimation of institutions in civil society or the state. Now, this might be done cynically, as many Indigenous critics have pointed out. It also may be done relatively earnestly in the name of maintaining the legitimacy of liberal democratic norms. Second answer is more optimistic and suggests that individuals are, or at least can be, moved by a categorical moral duty to recognize others as normative equals. This is Rainer Forst's answer, I think. The third one, internalization of norms. This kind of answer suggests that we can appeal, basically, in struggling for recognition, we can appeal to existing or cognitive norms. So according to Axel Honneth, struggles for recognition are often initiated on the basis of an unofficial moral consensus and in response to its norms being disrespected. And finally, the last answer, it's arguably the most complex, but I think it's going to be the most important for our discussion today. So often drawing from Hegel's famous master-slave dialectic, the idea here is that we are essentially recognition-desiring beings. And there's some harm that we do to ourselves when we withhold recognition from others, especially when we do so in the service of some false sense of independence or superiority. This lack of reciprocity creates, in the words of Alexander Kojève, an existential impasse for the literal or figurative master, because the recognition that he receives is deemed worthless because it's coming from the literal or figurative slave. Put simply, by misrecognizing others, the argument here is that we foreclose the possibility of receiving recognition in turn. You know, these possible answers I don't think fare well in contexts where the need for recognition, as I said, is most dire, namely in contexts like Frederick Douglass's, where there are pervasive norms of dehumanization, a particularly extreme form of misrecognition. So we can kind of go through these. One, self-legitimation. Recognition will likely not be even cynically conferred if the oppressed are not considered sources of political, democratic, or institutional legitimacy. And I think we can see this probably most clearly in Douglass's context with the infamous Dred Scott decision of 1857. Universal moral imperatives are unlikely to be followed in situations characterized by the systematic denial of the moral equality of persons. Indeed, failing to recognize such a moral status is only considered a failure if the status of personhood or human is at least implicitly conferred as well. It follows, too, that there are little to no norms of mutual recognition to appeal to and subsequently internalize. And finally, in many contexts, misrecognition or withholding recognition is not experienced as self-undermining or as an existential impasse, in Kojève's words, by powerful groups or individuals. Orlando Patterson in Slavery and Social Death captures this last problem very well. I quote, "I disagree totally with the view that slavery created an existential impasse for the master. In the first place, the master could and usually did achieve the recognition he needed from other free persons, including other masters," end quote. Now, this is absolutely true, but we can also generalize the objection as well. Why would a dominant society need or desire the recognition of a subjugated or minority group if they have other sources of recognition? Or why would that be experienced as self-undermining in any way? Okay. So we'll turn to Douglass now. So Douglass's name is not one that frequently appears in discussions of recognition. There are a few cases where people have discussed the importance of recognition for Douglass, but not so much the other way around. Despite this omission, I think that Douglass's name should probably appear in discussions of recognition. And I think that he viewed struggling for recognition as inextricable from the abolitionist cause. Douglass suggests in 1862 that true emancipation will require, quote, a radical revolution in all modes of thought which have flourished under the blighting slave system, which until this revolution is completed, the slave will again, quote, be bound in the invisible chains of slavery long after his iron chains are broken and forever buried out of sight. Now, Douglass's prediction, of course, will turn out to be an apt description of the Reconstruction period and its aftermath. I also included this picture here, which is from his office in his house in Washington. He, I guess it's maybe not super clear, but there's chains wrapped around the curtain. It was as a reminder not only of his past as an enslaved individual, but also the specter of second slavery. But my argument will be that Douglass is extremely attentive to how slavery's power was reinforced with invisible chains even before their iron counterparts were snapped. And of these invisible chains included the deleterious effects of widespread and culturally diffuse patterns of misrecognition. Now, there's many ways that this manifests itself. So, I mean, for one thing, he started his own journal after he broke from the Garrisonians, the North Star. He claimed that the purpose was to prove the claims of natural inferiority wrong. Okay. He's also, I think, very aware of the danger of the internalization of demeaning ideas. He also describes at many points in his autobiographies the transformative importance of his own experiences of affirmative recognition. But I'm going to be focusing here on the kind of misrecognition that Douglass speaks of the most and experienced himself and actively sought to combat in his life, and that was the misrecognition that is an essential feature of dehumanization. Okay. So the term that Douglass sometimes uses to describe dehumanization and its corresponding misrecognition is brutification, okay? So in his first autobiography, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, published in 1845, he writes of his experience of his years spent with the notorious overseer and slave breaker Edward Covey. And I'll read this whole quote with you here. So if at any one time of my life, more than another, I was made to drink the bitterest dregs of slavery, that time was during the first 6 months of my stay with Mr. Covey. Mr. Covey succeeded in breaking me. I was broken in body, soul, and spirit. My natural elasticity was crushed. My intellect languished. The disposition to read departed. The cheerful spark that lingered about my eye died. The dark night of slavery closed in upon me, and behold, a man transformed into a brute. Now, I think that understanding what Douglass means by being transformed into a brute will be key to the argument. So we'll ask, what is the brute? Now, there's many overlapping connotations to the term brute, but basically is that which is less than or other than human in the most essential or important ways, namely lacking in capacities for knowledge, moral reasoning and sentiments, and political life. So I included some examples here, bringing up the Latin root, speaks who don't know the difference between good and bad, as well as John Locke's nauseous brute, who's the individual who can't be integrated into political life. Now, crucially, also a part of the 19th century connotations of the brute is that we as humans are kind of on like a sliding scale between the divine and the brutish. And so that means that we can also descend into brutishness, even though we are in some way kind of constitutively or qualitatively different than the brute. Now, as you may imagine, the term brute took on many charged meanings in 19th century debates on slavery. The ideological justifications of chattel slavery often involved attributed abolitionists, Douglass included, in arguments meant to debunk ideas of natural inequality. They argued that any existing inequality was principally social in origin and caused by slavery, and they used this idea of being imbruted, brutified, in the service of this argument. And here we have basically two I think, two distinct but overlapping processes that are being identified. So the first one I'm calling external brutification. And external brutification refers solely to the treatment of individuals. To claim that one is externally brutified is to say that a living, breathing, feeling, moral, intellectual human being is being treated as if they were a brute or a mere thing. And we can see this sentiment clearly in this quote from the famous abolitionist Gregson. But those for whose emancipation we're striving are recognized by law and treated by their fellow beings as marketable commodities, as goods and chattels, as brute beasts. And this comes, associated with various kinds of mistreatment. Internal brutification, on the other hand, is concerned with the internal effects of slavery. So what Gregson is describing is a matter of misrecognition, that is the deliberate imposition of false ideas of brutishness onto humans, as well as the physical cruelty and mistreatment that follows. But the argument here is that an aspect of slavery's injustice and brutality is its inevitable and inherent propensity to weaken and destroy actual human faculties and capacities. Now, we see this sentiment very clearly in this quote from the Irish abolitionist Daniel O'Connell, states, "Slavery has a natural and inevitable tendency to brutalize every noble faculty of man. An American sailor who was cast away on the shore of Africa, where he was kept in slavery for 3 years, was at the expiration of that period found to be imbruted and stultified. He had lost all reasoning power." Now, Douglass makes both of these kinds of arguments throughout his work, but he typically emphasizes external brutification over internal brutification, though he acknowledges the existence of the latter. And this is because every external process of brutification is, for him, always an incomplete process. The thingification of a human being, to borrow a term from Aimé Césaire, is never completed, for the human being is not a mere thing. So Douglass frequently highlights his own agency during his time enslaved, as well as the agency, cunning intelligence, and humanity of others enslaved on the plantations he was on. Okay, so I think it should hopefully be clear why the motivational problem matters for Douglass. So first, Douglass views struggling for recognition as central to the abolitionist cause and the achievement of freedom. 2, Douglass is ceaselessly seeking ways of trying to convince a population to cease the brutification of their fellow humans. 3rd, the recognitive norms of dehumanization are so deeply embedded that accomplishing number 2 appears as a dead end. And finally, it's not immediately clear what existing resources there are to navigate this problem. So without existing resources at hand, Douglass needed to create them. So we'll now turn to one of his strategies for navigating the motivational problem. And I think that there are other strategies that he pursues, but I think that this one more or less uniquely operates on the kind of the socio-cultural or cognitive terrain. So the first step to understanding this strategy is to understand the self-dehumanization thesis that he advances. Now, this argument is probably rather familiar. Douglass suggests, quote, that the slaveholder as well as the slave is the victim of the slave system, end quote. But unlike enslaved individuals, the slaveholder does not experience external brutification. They're treated as human beings and dignified human beings by their wider societies. Instead, Douglass will argue that the slaveholder, in the process of mastery and tyrannizing others, experiences a form of internal brutification. So we start to see why this distinction, I think, is important. And he offers us two clear ways that the slaveholder self-brutifies or self-dehumanizes, both of which entail the alienation of essential human capacities. So one are innate sentiments, and the second is reason. Okay. So first, innate sentiments. So this first feature of self-brutification, Douglass argues that slaveholding and arguably any other violent form of tyranny necessarily involves the alienation of innate and pre-reflective sentiments such as sympathy, affection, and pity. And we could think of a pity not in this kind of the sense that we think about it now, where there's maybe a kind of sense of superiority, but more in the sense that Rousseau meant it by like PTA. In his speech, The Anti-Slavery Movement, Douglass states that the slave is bound to mankind by the powerful and inextricable network of human brotherhood. His voice is the voice of a man, and his cry is the cry of a man in distress, and man must cease to be a man before he can become insensible to that cry, end quote. So not only is Douglass suggesting here that there's an innate and shared sense of humanity, he says that we do and we ought to instinctively distinguish between men and brutes, but that when we lose this feeling of the humanity or sense of humanity of others, we lose that humanity for ourselves. Accordingly, Douglass then frequently calls slaveholders and overseers brutes in his accounts of their abuses. There's many, many examples of this. Now, this is an argument, should be noted, this is an argument that depends neither on a view of the baseness of human nature, nor the idiosyncratic moral character of any individual. He states very clearly instead that the treatment is part of a system rather than part of the man. But this does not absolve responsibility. He also states that the master is, quote, the author of his own subjection. So here, I'll offer a case study to clarify. So this Sophia Auld will serve as an excellent example of the interplay between these external pressures. So for her, not only the demands of mastery, but also patriarchy and a husband's authority, and the process of self-authored brutification. So as a child, Douglass was sent to live in Baltimore with Hugh and Sophia Auld, which on the whole marked an immediate improvement to his living conditions compared to the rural Lloyd plantation. In particular, Miss Sofa, as Douglass called Sophia Auld at the age of 9, was initially an unprecedented source of kindness, care, and warmth in the boy's life, which Douglass attributes to her having not previously been a slaveholder. Whereas Douglass describes having been treated as a pig on Colonel Lloyd's plantation, he was treated as a child now, and soon learned to regard Sophia Auld as something more akin to a mother than a slaveholding mistress, end quote. Mrs. Auld also played the formative role in the young Douglass's life as one of his earliest educators, fostering his desire for education by reading the Bible together. Famously, her husband, Master Hugh, put a quick end to it, suggesting that Douglass would be, quote, ruined as a slave if he learned to read, which the young Douglass cites as, quote, the first decidedly anti-slavery lecture to which it has been my lot to listen. Mm-hmm. While Douglass found other sources of informal education in his relatively dense urban environment, his relationship with Sophia Auld soured. Douglass writes that she initially regarded me as a child, like any other child. She had not come to regard me as property. Upon Hugh Auld's scolding, the latter became a reality, though this was, he says, a thing of conventional growth, whereas the first was natural and spontaneous. It was Sophia Auld's natural love for Douglass that had to be suppressed and overridden by the demands of the artificial institution of slavery. But though we may blame the institution, Sophia Auld had to initiate for herself a self-transformation. He says she had to justify herself to herself, however much her nature rebelled within her. It was not an easy transformation. He says it took several years to change the natural sweetness of her temper into fretful bitterness. But to live and act as a slaveholding mistress, it was necessary that she forget Douglass's human character, her nature and character, and, quote, to treat him as a thing destitute of a moral and an intellectual character. This forgetting of Douglass's human nature on the part of Mrs. Auld was a deliberate process of brutification. He, quote, I was more than chattel. I could talk and sign. I could laugh and hate. I was human, and she, dear lady, knew and felt me to be so. How could she then treat me as a brute without a mighty struggle with all the noble powers of her soul? Okay. Now to the second feature of self-brutification, the alienation of reason. So slaveholding likewise entails the alienation of our unique, he thinks, a unique faculty of reason. And he means this in two senses. So I've got 2.1 and 2.2. The first sense is that deep racial prejudice impedes our capacity to reason clearly. And the second is that the practice of slaveholding destroys reason's ability to appropriately modulate or filter the sentiments or passions. So this first 2.1 here, okay. So in 1854, Douglass gave a controversial address to the prestigious literary societies on the topic of ethnology. In this speech, Douglass directly addresses a major, albeit generally pseudoscientific, academic debate at the time concerning the origins of the human race. Douglass in this speech describes how, quote, "When men oppress their fellow men, the oppressor ever finds in the character of the oppressed a full justification for his oppression. Ignorance and depravity and the inability to rise from degradation to civilization and respectability are the most usual allegations against the oppressed. The evils most fostered by slavery and oppression are precisely those which slaveholders and oppressors would transfer from their system to the inherent character of its victims. Thus, the very crimes of slavery become slavery's best defense. By making the enslaved a character fit only for slavery, they excuse themselves for refusing to make the slave a free man." Now, I think Douglass in this speech offers or accomplishes a double inversion here. So not only are the ignorance, depravity that the oppressor imbues as inherent to the character of the oppressed, both fabricated and fostered by the oppressor, so as we've seen in external and internal processes of brutification, but Douglass will reveal that it is in fact the oppressor who is ignorant and depraved. So later in the speech, he says, on the one hand, that common sense is scarcely needed to know that people of African descent are human. Still, he goes on to meticulously scrutinize the arguments presented in Samuel Morton's Crania Americana, very, very famous book of ethnology at the time, stating that it's the province of prejudice to blind. And Morton's book is presented as a prime example of the reasoning of men who reason from prejudice rather than from facts. Now, reason, according to Douglass, also plays the function, as I mentioned, of modulating the passions, both the good and the bad. So although we've witnessed cases where individuals rationalize their way out of heeding to their natural sentiments, Douglass also thinks that there's context where the sentiments should be tempered. That it's through our reason that we come to contextualize and evaluate the appropriateness of our sentimental responses to situations. So here's a quote that's an example of the good way of kind of modulating one's sentiments or passions. So in the article, The Right to Kill a Kidnapper, Douglass states the following: "The shedding of human blood at first sight and without explanation is and must ever be regarded with horror. Contemplated in the light and warmth of these feelings, it is in all cases a crime to deprive a human being of life. But God has not left us solely to the guidance of our feelings, having endowed us with reason as well as with feeling, and it is in the light of reason that this question ought to be decided." He goes on to defend the right to kill the kidnapper attempting to return the fugitive to slavery, even though this entails restraining or overriding the natural aversion to the death and suffering of others. Now, conversely, actually, I'll go back to the, conversely, there are those passions which more often than not should be tempered. So Douglass writes in My Bondage to My Freedom that there's no relation more unfavorable to the development of honorable character than that sustained by the slaveholder to the slave. Reason is imprisoned here and the passions run wild. Now, Douglass provides many harrowing examples of the passions running wild throughout his speeches and autobiographies. Not unlike Plato's depiction of the tyrant, Douglass describes his old master, Captain Anthony, as, quote, "a wretched man at war with his own soul and with all the world around him." Okay. So We've now seen why Douglass suggests, perhaps counterintuitively, quote, that slavery is a greater evil to the master than to the slave. To persistently dehumanize others, in sum, is necessarily to self-dehumanize. And this self-dehumanization or self-brutification is self-authored, meaning it is a self-initiated form of internal but not external brutification. There is then a discrepancy between the slaveholder's internal moral and psychic character and how he or she is treated. In highlighting this discrepancy, Douglass has both established a potential self-directed reason or motivation to cease oppressing, tyrannizing, or slaveholding, as well as a contradiction that he can rhetorically and politically leverage as part of an abolitionist politics of shame. And the demand of this politics of shame will be that slaveholders are properly recognized for their lack of humanity and correspondingly be shamed by others. Now, immediately there's a problem with this claim. How could shaming slaveholders possibly be effective? This problem is connected to the one that we began with, which is that the master has no incentive to recognize the slave, and likewise would probably have feel no reason to be ashamed. But shame, as opposed to guilt, pertains not to a deed, but to who one is. But who one is often tied to values and standards. As Bernard Boxall notes in his critical discussion of Douglass's moral suasionism, quote, a person can be shamed for a failing only if he has internalized the standards that make it a failing. And therefore, slaveholders could not possibly be shamed for holding slaves because they had not internalized those standards. One can only be effectively shamed for dehumanizing others if they grant at the outset that it is a human they are dehumanizing in the first place. Moreover, slaveholders more often than not found themselves in social milieus that vindicated their pre-existing views on the matter, not to mention the considerable financial incentive. Now, Douglass is not ignorant of these problems. On the one hand, he had some reasons to believe that shame could at least be somewhat effective in restraining the worst excesses of slavery. He notes at a few points that abuses, for instance, are less common in more densely populated areas. On the other hand, and more importantly, the individuals that Douglass most often sought to move with his rhetoric of shame were not slaveholders, but his white northern audiences. Not only was a lecture tour in the South at the time off the table for the sake of safety, but Douglass knew that shaming slaveholders would not work. His actual audiences, though, generally consisted of white Northerners, many of whom had deeply embedded racial prejudices, but were more susceptible to getting on board with abolitionist and less often anti-racist causes. These were individuals that Douglass thought could be shamed and persuaded into being anti-slavery, or at least more anti-slavery. Douglass states in an 1849 speech that the sword might be required at the South, but it was not necessary at the North. Now, the mechanics of this rhetoric of shame, I argue, are processes of identification and disidentification. So much like in his Send Back the Money campaign in 1846 against the Free Church of Scotland, who had received donations from American slaveholders, the desired effect of this rhetoric, broadly speaking, is the disidentification with slaveholders and often and others, complicit with slavery. So, financially, politically, symbolically, or otherwise. Quote, even if we don't have that blood-stained money sent back, Douglass orates, one thing we shall have accomplished by holding these meetings is that Scotland has within her a people who disclaim all connection with those who took the money, that the majority are with the oppressed and against the oppressor, end quote. This disidentification, often accomplished by means of shaming, in turn lends itself to a greater aggregation of shame oriented towards slavery and slaveholding. However, even when non-Southern whites were not or did not need to be directly and explicitly shamed, shame nonetheless plays a vicarious function that emboldens the disidentification with slaveholders and to some extent the South as a whole. That is, to publicly shame slaveholders for their brutishness can have the effect of fostering a self-understanding among white Northerners that eschews and disidentifies with the ideals of white mastery. Now, disidentification does often look like misrecognition. But if Douglass is correct that to suggest that the slaveholders' humanity becomes disfigured in the process of slaveholding, then to disidentify with the humanity of the slaveholder is actually to properly recognize the slaveholder, that is to properly recognize the slaveholder as a brute. It's kind of the clever reversal that Douglass is accomplishing. Ironically, then, one feature of Douglass's solution to the widespread external brutification of Black Americans is the external brutification of the slaveholder. That is to treat the slaveholder as a brute in the way that the broader society generally fails to do in order to have the appearance of slaveholding match its reality. By calling a slaveholder the brute, Douglass, as well as other abolitionists to some extent, is conducting this external brutification and encouraging others to view the slaveholder in this light. So we have an example, a more specific example of the dynamics of identification and disidentification in real time in Douglass's 1850 address, Men and Brothers in New York City. So there was an abolitionist event being held, and it was interrupted by pro-slavery agitators who rushed the stage. This isn't actually a picture from that talk, but there were many abolitionist events that were violently interrupted, and that is a drawing of one of them. So following a white supremacist pro-slavery speech, Douglass, with the leader of these thugs, Isaiah Rynders, at his elbow, asks his audience to reason with him. He says, "I invite you to the examination, and I ask this audience to judge, am I a man?" Rynders responds by pointing out that Douglass was only half Black. Douglass responds in turn to Rynders' disingenuous partial recognition of his humanity with a partial disidentification with Rynders' humanity. And in the most famous quote from this speech, Douglass says, "He is correct. I am indeed a half-brother to Mr. Rynders," which got a lot of laughs as it was recorded. Douglass's first invitation to judge his humanity is followed by an affective identification with him at the expense of his opponent through humor. The desired effect upon whom the rhetorical strategy was successful is a closer identification with Douglass than Rynders. Rynders is only Douglass's half-brother. Those unencumbered by the cognitive and affective impairments fostered by slavery, on the other hand, can easily, or as he says, instinctively apprehend and feel, quote, the common brotherhood of man. Okay. So, yeah, we're good. All right. So how can this rhetoric of shame be understood as an essential feature of Douglass's answer to the motivational problem? Come full circle now. So first, I think that Douglass is offering a variation of the existential impasse argument, or the argument that misrecognition is self-undermining. However, instead of the impasse being the result of directly undermining the source of one's own recognition, it concerns the harm done to one's own essential human faculties and capacities. In this way, Douglass is responding at least partially to Patterson's challenge. That is, why would the master care about mutual recognition with the slave? Even though it was unlikely that many slaveholders were going to be receptive to Douglass's shaming, he is nevertheless offering a model for a politics of shame that might have a higher likelihood of succeeding, even with those who benefit most from the oppressive or tyrannical system. These appeals to self-interest, moreover, neither depended on racial paternalism, a la Harriet Beecher Stowe, or economic self-interest, which was one of the kind of anti-slavery arguments, even coming from the South, but could actually bring one closer to the desirable moral position. Second, even if the external brutification of the slaveholder fails to directly evoke any feelings of shame, which most often would not, as we've seen, this politics of shame could also work vicariously. So if Patterson is correct that the reason why there's no existential impasse for the master is that he or she had other sources of recognition, Douglass's abolitionist response is to erode those existing sources of recognition. Underpinning this suggestion is the assumption that white slaveholders, or complicit whites more broadly, likely cared more about being viewed in positive terms by the United Kingdom, white Northerners, or other whites who may have a distaste for slavery. And on this note, Douglass would frequently remind his American audiences of how other countries viewed them at the time. Okay, and finally, it should be acknowledged that the motivational problem in Douglass's context was not confined to the South or to slaveholders. His escape to New York in 1838 could be said to have only secured him what he calls comparative freedom. Exacerbated by the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, betrayal, paid slave catchers, and discrimination was around every corner. In sum, a great deal of Northerners also had to be given reasons to recognize the humanity of approximately 1/6 of their fellow Americans. Through the brutification of slaveholders, as we've seen, Douglass's appeal to white Americans, largely in the North, is to disidentify with them. This source of shame arguably helped the construction or sedimentation of an anti-slavery or even anti-Southern antebellum identity. Now, that's a claim that can't be proven necessarily, but it is substantiated by accounts of Northern attitudes leading up to the Civil War. Okay. Now I'll just mention a few kind of key takeaways as a conclusion, and then we'll take our break. So first, if we're to assume that struggling for recognition can be a legitimate, desirable, and effective strategy for achieving social justice, at least of some form, then one lesson we may take away from Douglass is that we also have to be attentive not only to the psychology and motivations of those seeking recognition, but also the oppressor's dominant society or any other addressees of the politics of recognition. Otherwise, the struggle for recognition just doesn't get off the ground. 2, Douglass's work is instructive for thinking more deeply about when or how politics of shame might work today, as well as who it might work on. Shaming, both directly and vicariously, is more likely to be effective when there's a pre-existing self-understanding that at least partially subscribes to the standards that would make the experience of shame possible. And finally, Douglass also highlights the limits of the politics of shame that he himself undertakes. Quote, he says, "We're pleased that the whites are finding that they cannot degrade their black brother without sharing his degradation," end quote. But Douglass also often noted that this sentiment did not exempt white abolitionists and others from vicious anti-black racism. In other words, the problem is less that the politics of shame ceases or fails to move anyone to action or to persuade, though this can also be true, but that it does not penetrate its object deeply enough. In Douglass's case, this means that it might only be enough to conjure strictly anti-slavery sentiments and judgments. Becoming anti-racist, let alone an abolitionist, might require a more profound internal transformation and redefinition of humanity. Thank you.